Hey guys, I'm doing my Unit 9 presentation on compensating college athletes. And I got my information mostly off of two different sites. One of them was Should College Athletes Be Paid by Jonathan Brill. And the other one was from Sport Top 10, and it's the top 10 reasons college athletes should be paid. So I'm just going to answer the questions right up front, and then I'll provide some of my findings. Do I believe athletes should be paid? No, I don't. But I think it's a very complex and broad-based issue. Number two, what are the positives and negatives? And should athletes be able to acquire a job? So I'm going to answer those two questions in my comments here. So I think where we're at right now in America is a much different place than where Theodore Roosevelt envisioned us being when he created the NCAA back in 1905. You know, his vision was that young people who were pursuing college careers academically could be lured into participating in amateur sports. You know, amateurism is a concept that a lot of young people today probably have never even heard of, but that's a bedrock principle of college athletics in America, that it was quote unquote crucial to preserve an academic environment while acquiring a quality education. And that quality education was the first priority. So I think understanding what amateurism was intended to be and what it's increasingly not being is an important part of the conversation. So in my own terminology, I kind of feel like this issue is like putting toothpaste back in the tube. You know, it's like a lot of issues in America. It's kind of just been neglected, and now it's kind of bulged into this problem that there really is no easy solution to it. There's really no winners. You know, if you went with paying athletes, it damages the purity of academics. And if you go with not paying athletes, then we continue to let some of these top tier schools basically exploit their players. And that's what they're doing. They're just exploiting them. So here's a couple of statistics that I think are worth noting. The NCAA is turned into a market. You know, it's so far off track of its original intent that it's functioning as its own little separate economy, and it's driven by market principles. And so you can't really apply the purity of amateurism and look at it through just that lens, because it's not functioning that way anymore. It's all about money, and it's all about the dollar as the source of all evil, so to speak. You know, the NCAA modernized and took full advantage of lots of new sports fans since the advent of different forms of media. You know, the media is now in bed, so to speak, with sports, to the point that there's billion-dollar contracts that are at stake, you know, year after year. There's huge sums of money, billions of dollars. And so I think everybody looks at that big piece of pie and they want a piece of it. And it brings out the worst in everybody. So today, sports and athletics and the NCAA draw on around $11 billion every year for their organization. And coaches and administrators that are affiliated with NCAA, they're making staggering amounts of money. For example, a typical average D1 AA coach's salary in football is $5 million a year. And, you know, that's just like commonplace to us now. You know, we read about Albert Pujols signing, you know, he's holding out for a $200 million contract. And we kind of like get desensitized to these numbers because they're so big. And, you know, you just can't even relate to them, especially if you're, you know, you come from the middle class or the lower middle class. You can't even imagine that type of money. It's mind-boggling. So it's justifiable for a lot of these athletes at this level, the premier elite level, who are contributing to media sales, and they're contributing to ticket draw, and they're contributing to merchandising and video games and all these other sources of revenue, it would be very easy to see why they would want to have some compensation. But my contention is that once you go down that road, you're never coming back, and there's no coming back from it. And the problem is that it would really change the nature of sports forever in our country. And I don't know if there's an easy answer. There's a lot of advocates of shared revenue models. That is, you can find a lot of information on the internet about that or in other sources. But basically, the concept there is that players are getting a share, like in almost in a business model, where there's formulas for figuring out a percentage that the players would get as compensation, and it would vary from sports environment to sports environment. And my contention is not only would that be really difficult to figure out, but it would really change the whole nature of sport. Is the purpose of college athletics to get an education, or is it to play sports? And the reality is for a lot of the D1 athletes, it's about playing sports. And I don't think that there's a simple way to rewind that and go backwards. Another interesting statistic is that a lot of these guys are putting in 40 plus hours. When I say guys, I mean male and female, excuse me. A lot of these athletes are putting in 40 plus hours a week, and it's like they're working a full-time job. So again, another argument for why they might be that they should be compensated. Another frustrating thing for these athletes, male and female D1 athletes, is that many of them have their eyes on going pro, and their intention isn't to pursue academics. We always hear that creed. Get your degree, go. But a lot of these D1 athletes, that's what they want to do. And so if we're basing this on a market economy, then we should be fair, and we should say we're not going to have age restrictions in our pro leagues, and we're going to have developmental leagues that don't have age restrictions on them. So if younger, talented athletes want to go join a professional league at the lower, like say D level, when they're 18 or 19, that doesn't impede on or convolute the issue of amateur status for other athletes. So that's one concept to consider. Here's another statistic. Former college stars, people that did attend college and got scholarship and then pursued professional sport afterwards. Say, for example, professional indoor football players. They're going to make about, on average, $225 a game with a $25 bonus if the team wins. That's just a rough average. In the NBA, players in the developmental league, they're a step away from making it to the NBA. They're making around $50,000 a year. So, if you compare that kind of pay, which is fairly low, which is what the majority of college athletes who don't make it into the top tier level of professional sports would actually be getting paid. Because we're always comparing professional salaries to the highest examples of professional salaries, when really we should compare it to the average or the lower end, because that's where the majority of professional athletes are getting paid. So in those developmental leagues, $50,000 a year, I mean, they're going to get more compensation from a scholarship. So maybe that's a good argument for maintaining the system as it is now. I mentioned merchandising. That's an issue. I mean, if you give each player a percentage of how much their jersey sold for, how's that going to work out for D1 schools that can't get a contract with, some Under Armour company or with Nike? It would just be, to me, it would be a nightmare to figure that out. Here's another statistic. March Madness generated over $770 million in TV rights alone. That's a lot of money. And ironically, like we read in the Knight Commission, that money doesn't go to academics. That money doesn't get compensated back to athletes. It doesn't get put back into academic incentives. That nearly $1 billion in just that tournament alone for March Madness is used for other purposes, and a lot of people look at that as, a source of injustice. So in 2014, there was a state court of appeals for the Ninth Circuit, and it issued a ruling that the NCAA, and it kind of favored both sides here, but the court sided with the players and affirmed that the NCAA is not immune from antitrust regulation. So in other words, the government's seeing that the NCAA is basically turned into a giant corporation. And so they're applying antitrust regulations upon them. That's a step in the right direction. Maybe that will lead to some more equity with how that revenue is spent, and it hopefully will favor athletes, and it'll favor student athletes. It'll provide incentives for student athletes, which I think was the main emphasis of the Knight Commission, is how is all this revenue being spent? It has to go back to benefiting the student athletes somehow. Otherwise, it's obviously they're just being exploited, as I mentioned earlier. So those were a few interesting statistics that I found. And like I said, this is a very complex issue, and I have very strong feelings about preserving amateurism, because I think it is tied to, kind of like the foundation of our country and our perspective on athletics. Are we a money-based or a greed-based society in terms of our pursuit of sport, or are we going to preserve the spiritual component or the character developing component and putting academics first for our athletes? It really looks like one of those issues that's going to be really hard to go backwards on. And so those were a few of my thoughts on the issue. Congratulations to all you guys on making it to the end this last week of the class. Hope you guys enjoy the rest of your summer. Take care, and God bless.